teaches us a lot about Machiavelli's perspective appears in chapter 6 and has to do with Moses. Okay? Now, Moses was one of the great patriarchs of Judaism and Christianity. Okay? And even of Islam, although Islam would be irrelevant in this context. Okay? Moses was a great figure. He brought the Jewish people the Ten Commandments. All right? And most people of Machiavelli's day were Catholic Christians, okay? And they believed in Moses and the Bible stories about Moses. All right, so we'll be talking about those. So we know what Machiavelli's talking about when he refers to Moses. Moses brought not only the Ten Commandments, but Moses in the Bible is shown as doing a lot of miracles, a lot of really spectacular miracles. So, in other words, when Machiavelli deals with Moses, he's dealing with a highly charged figure, somebody that every one of his readers would have known about. None of them would have wanted to say a bad word about. All of them would have been very, feeling reverential about Moses. All right? But Machiavelli deals with Moses not in that way entirely. Okay? He sort of does one of those Machiavellian things where at first he sounds like he's being reverent and humble about Moses, but then he also discusses Moses in a way that devout people would object to. If you take a look at page 19, and that's in chapter 6, the second page in chapter 6, he at first says, obviously we should not discuss Moses' skill, for he was a mere agent following the instructions given him by God. So he should be admired not for his own skill, but for that grace that made him worthy to talk with God. But let us discuss Cyrus and the others who have acquired existing kingdoms or founded new ones. Okay? Now that sounds like, first of all, he's not going to discuss Moses anymore. That's what he says. And the reason why is because he really didn't have skill. All right? He had God's help. All right? So he acknowledges there that what most people think, all right, sounds like he thinks it's true. Moses didn't use his own skill. He used God's power. God used him in a way. Okay? If you're familiar with the story, you know that Moses didn't even want to do any leading. He said, no, I don't want to do that. God insisted. Okay? And actually had to get his brother involved because Moses was uncomfortable doing it by himself. So it would sound like what most people would believe about Moses and what the Bible says, that he was simply following the instructions given him by God. Okay. So you wouldn't expect Machiavelli to talk anymore about Moses, right? Because he just said he's not going to. But then in the next paragraph, he then says, thus it was necessary for Moses to find the people of Israel in Egypt, enslaved and oppressed by the Egyptians, so they, in order to escape from slavery, would be prepared to follow him. And then he follows that with a sentence about another leader. It was essential for Romulus to have no future in Alba. It was appropriate he should have been exposed at birth, otherwise he would not have formed the ambition of becoming king of Rome and succeeding in founding that nation. He mentions Cyrus and the others. All right, so, first of all, we have to notice, hopefully, that he's done what he said he wasn't going to do. Okay? He said, we're not going to talk about Moses because it wasn't skill, but God's instructions that did it. And yet, in the next paragraph, he talks about Moses again. And he talks about Moses in the same way as he talks about the other leaders that he just said are distinguished from him. Romulus, Cyrus, Theseus, and so forth that he gets to. Those are all ancient founders. Romulus is actually a mythical founder of Rome. Probably didn't really exist, right? But Cyrus and Theseus were real people, okay? And he's just said he's not going to do that because that would be equating somebody who did things on a spiritual level with some people who did things at a political level, right? And then he does that. So that kind of makes one think a little bit. What is Machiavelli really saying here? It was necessary for Moses to find the people of Israel in Egypt enslaved and oppressed by the Egyptians. so they, in order to escape from slavery, would be prepared to follow him. How does that make Moses seem? What was he up to? Okay. He's writing about this, so we're talking about it. Okay? Now, what he seems to be saying here is that, Moses saw a situation that he could use. All right? What was that?
To make him look better.
Well, yeah. I mean, he saw a situation that he could exploit or use to make himself look better, to make himself look like a leader, which is totally not the way he's depicted in the Bible story. But still, his language is a little ambiguous. Yeah.
Could you say, like, he was kind of comparing Moses to one of his ideas of taking power, like getting involved in something else, someone else's problem, and you could capitalize on it?
Exactly. We don't really like to think about it this way, and many of you have been taught the story the way it's written up in the Bible, so it's a little bit jarring to hear somebody say that Moses might have just been sort of taking advantage of a situation, or like you say, hopping into a situation where there's weakness and using it, okay? People were enslaved by the Egyptians. The Hebrews were enslaved by the Egyptians, okay? Which normally would be seen as a complete disaster, okay? A terrible situation. But Machiavelli admires leaders who can look at terrible situations and see them as opportunities, okay? If you can divorce yourself from your feelings about what Machiavelli says about Moses for a second and just see what he's saying about the type of mentality that you have to be a really successful leader. He's trying to teach us something. A successful leader never sees a catastrophe. They always see an opportunity. Okay? You have to be flexible and creative to be a successful leader. All right? So the way Machiavelli sees Moses is he saw a situation of oppression where he could be a leader. All right? Now, that's sort of implied here, but not stated directly. But he does say, now continuing on page 20, something else which contradicts the Bible story. Now, the Bible story says that Moses got the people out of Egypt by using God's miracles. God kept sending plagues on Egypt to scare the Pharaoh. The Pharaoh, the leader of Egypt, kept saying, no, I won't let these people go. And then another plague happened and he'd waver. And then he, get stubborn again. But eventually, the people of Israel were allowed to go, and they escaped, and they went across the sea. Moses parted the sea for them, and all these miracles happened. Well, he doesn't sound like he did that through the use of an army in the Bible story. It sounds like, God was the only army Moses had. Okay? But if you take a look at page 20, Machiavelli sees it differently. He says, when he can stand on his own feet and can resort to force, then the prince can usually overcome the dangers he faces. Thus it is that all armed prophets are victorious and disarmed ones are crushed. For there is another problem. People are by nature inconstant. It is easy to persuade them of something, but it is difficult for them to stop them from changing their minds. So you have to be prepared for the moment when they no longer believe. Then you have to force them to believe. Moses, Cyrus, Theseus, and Romulus would not have been able to make their peoples obey their new structures of authority for long if they had been unarmed. Okay? Now, I don't think that's ambiguous. Moses' success in keeping the people unified was through his arms. And that is not the way it's written up in the Scripture. Okay? Now, I'm pointing this out because Machiavelli is not shy about, as I've already told you, about changing the account of things. Okay? Whether it's the Bible or whether it's ancient Roman history or whatever it is, he will change the account of things to suit his own purposes. So that's partly what he's doing here. He's changing the story to suit his purposes. But also he's putting a wedge in people's beliefs about this very important figure. Okay? So I hope that you can see how this might be seen as a demoralizer or a criticism of traditional beliefs. And those who have those beliefs might see what Machiavelli says is somewhat threatening. Okay? Today we're kind of used to deconstruction and remanipulation and questioning of everything, but in these days that was not the case. So such a teaching would be seen as threatening to people's beliefs. This is just a very poignant thing to say, and it sort of sums up his belief about leaders, whether they're religious leaders or secular leaders. If they're armed, they conquer. If they're unarmed, they're ruined. Arms are very important. Okay? You can't lead just by the use of your spiritual authority if you do not have that. All right? So the most cynical interpretation of this is that Machiavelli is suggesting that Moses used religion as a tool. That Machiavelli is completely overturning the traditional notion of Moses' role, and therefore calling into question religious leaders generally, which was not an unusual thing. It was starting to happen at this time in relation to the Catholic Church. The Reformation completed that questioning. Okay? People were beginning to wonder, are religious leaders always sincere, or do they sometimes use religion for their own purposes? This was a new thought. Okay? And so by turning to Moses, he too is agreeing with that thought in a way, and furthering that thought, right? But also he's admiring it. Now, the Protestant reformers didn't admire it, okay? They wanted to bring religion back to its purity. They thought that the church had become corrupt, and they wanted to change that. Machiavelli, on the other hand, admires it, okay? So he's not a reformer in that sense. Instead, he wants to show people how it can be used, and used effectively to make things better, to unify Italy, to make people believe strong enough to fight for their country. All right. So that gets him started, and that gets us started in understanding Machiavelli's perspective. He takes a great icon of Judeo-Christianity and turns it on its head, so to speak. Okay? Calls it into question. He shows a different way of looking at religion, which he repeats throughout this book. Okay? When he says the best use of religion for the prince is to appear to be faithful while not being faithful. Okay? Machiavelli says here, the man of virtue, the prince of virtue, conquers fortune. Okay? Now, fortune is a concept that he develops pretty well in here. It's just basically luck, the things that happen to you in life. And there's two kinds of people. There's the type of person, as I say, who sort of accepts their fate. And he thought too many leaders were like that, didn't try hard enough. And then there are those leaders who look at it as an opportunity and who change their fortune as a result of what life throws them. Okay? Machiavelli advises a new way of looking at it entirely. He says, a smart prince is one who looks at fortune, or what life throws you, as putty or clay. Okay? Material that can be used. You should see everything around you as material that can be used. And not despair, but rather think creatively and cleverly. He needs to see what he can do as being sort of the sculptor of that clay, which is a really attractive way to think of yourself as a leader. Taking that clay, the people, the natural occurrences, whether they're good or bad, okay? The things that life throws you, when the enemy attacks, for instance, or when the plague comes through. All right, whatever life gives you, taking that, using it as clay, and impressing upon it your form. Okay? Not just any form, not just order, but the expression of your own personality. Machiavelli wants to appeal to the prince to say, this can be a monument to you. You can build a monument to yourself. Because why does a prince do all the things he does? Hopefully not just to be rich, which you can do without being a prince, but because you want to create something lasting that will continue your fame long after you're dead. Machiavelli really thought that the prince would be attracted to that appeal, to continue his fame long after he's dead and make a monument to himself. So he says the prince needs to look upon the people and all the other things as clay upon which he can impress his own form, his own image, right, as a monument to himself, and therefore transform any bad luck into good luck. So one of the chief aspects of Machiavellian virtue is this flexibility that so many people lack, okay, whether they're in leadership positions or not. They never sit back and think, okay, plan A didn't work. How can I make this stuff work? Okay? Once plan A doesn't work, a lot of people just throw up their hands and they wallow in it. They can't figure out what to do next. Machiavelli wants somebody for whom, if plan A doesn't work, they say, great, this is an even better thing to do, okay? And they continue to be like that. The person who can continue to adapt to the situation is going to win over the inflexible person every time, okay? It's not going to work. You know, some part of the inflexible person's plan is not going to work and they're going to be stymied. The person with flexibility is never going to be stymied. And flexibility includes this notion of creativity and amorality, because one chief way in which people can be inflexible is in their morality, in Machiavelli's view. So they have to be able to see all possibilities and not be limited by a moral framework, by a political framework, by their own ego or anything else from doing what they can do to improve their situation. Here's a guy who was a hero to Machiavelli in a lot of ways. He was such a good example of virtue as we've just described it. He could take any situation and work it to his advantage. And he appears in chapter 7, Cesare Borgia. Okay? Cesare Borgia, as you know from the video, was actually the son of Pope Alexander, which was not supposed to happen. Okay, there was the ideal of celibacy then as well as now, but back then, I mean, the video really told it like it was. Okay, back then the church was experiencing a lot of corruption, and it was really rather open, and this was what got the church into trouble and caused so much discontent. It was really rather open, so much so that people knew that Cesare Borgia was a son of the Pope. Okay. Now, you would think that that would be a real drawback to your popularity. That maybe people wouldn't want to have anything to do with you. You know, I mean, if they were good Christians, they'd want to stay away. You know, be disgusted with the whole thing. He had some uphill climbing to do. Okay, so Cesare didn't rely upon popularity. Okay, he relied upon his own cleverness, and he was very clever. And he did use his relationship with Alexander to his benefit, because Alexander wanted to do something for his son. He wanted to use his own political power to help his son. And so Cesare didn't say, oh my gosh, you know, no way, I'm going to do this all on my own, like a lot of kids do. He said, I'm going to use whatever he can give me and whatever else I can get too. All right? So Machiavelli says he did all things with prudence and virtue. And Machiavelli tells this story. He says his father helped him take the Romagna. Now, the Romagna is the area just north of the Papal States. Your map at the front of your book shows you that. Let me just switch back here for a second. Okay. Here's the Papal States, and they extend across the whole peninsula here. Here's the Romagna. Okay. You can see it right here. And I think it extended up to about here. So you can see it would have added on to the papal lands. All right. Okay. Okay. How come all the people who talk sit right in the front row? I've been wondering that all semester. Anyway, so what did his father do? Well, his father used his alliance with the French to bring in auxiliary troops. Those were French troops that he could use. Okay, so Cesare used them. And also his father bribed all the notable people in the area who might otherwise oppose them with money, but often with promises of offices that Cesare would give them status and position, right, if they would not fight him and would support him. And this worked wonderfully. Okay, no one opposed him. Borgia was able to ride in and take this land without any opposition to speak of. Okay? So he got it easily. And believe me, Machiavelli thinks that if you can get it easily, you should. There's no reason why you should do it the hard way. Okay? Now the problem was for Borgia that after he got there, things were not so easy to control. And he didn't have to deal so much with the elites who had been subdued by his father's actions, but he did have to deal with all that crime, because what he found was that this land had not been well ruled at all, and there was a lot of crime. There were a lot of bandits, there was a lot of marauding, and so, the people were frightened to death, and the bullies, the thugs, basically ran the place. All right? So he knew he had to do something about this. And he had to do something quite dramatic. This is a great example of using cruelty well and of using it very quickly up front in order to accomplish, basically peace and good order. So he tells the story of what Cesare Borgia did. Halfway down page 24, he says, once Borgia had subdued the Romagna, he found that it had been under the control of weak nobles who had rather exploited than governed their subjects, and had rather been the source of conflict than of order. With the result, the whole province was full of robbers, bandits, and every other type of criminal. So he decided it was necessary, if he was going to make the province peaceful and obedient to his commands, to give it good government. He put Mr. Ramiro de Orco, a man both cruel and efficient, in charge and gave him absolute power. Okay, so he took a henchman and he put him in as governor, more or less. And he said, do whatever it takes. Okay? De Orco, in short order, established peace and unity and acquired immense authority. At that point, the Duke decided that such unchecked power was no longer necessary, for he feared people might come to hate it. So, in other words, De Orco used a lot of cruelty, terrorized people, all right? And then, Borgia began to think, well, if I let this go on much longer, people will hate me. And he accomplished his task anyway. There was no more crime, okay? So what did he do? Well, he says, so Borgia established a civil court in the center of the province, placing an excellent judge in charge of it and requiring every city to appoint a lawyer to represent it before court. So he actually established a judicial, institution there. He put up courts, he put up advocates for the various areas in the Romagna. And since he knew the harsh measures of the past had given rise to some animosity towards him, in order to purge the ill will of the people and win them completely over to him, he wanted to make it clear that if there had been any cruelty, he was not responsible for it, and that his hard-hearted minister should be blamed. He saw his opportunity and exploited it. One morning in the town square of Cesena, he had Mr. de Orco's corpse laid out in 2 pieces, with a chopping board and a bloody knife beside it. This ferocious sight made the people of the Romagna simultaneously happy and dumbfounded. Yes. So he made an example of Mr. de Orco. Now, he knew what de Orco was up to, okay? He knew because he ordered him to do it. So, but then when he was no longer useful, and he wanted to change the minds of the people, he had to do something very dramatic. What could be more dramatic than having him cut in half, drawn and quartered, and thrown into the town square for everybody to see? So the people would have thought that Cesare didn't know what his governor was up to, and that he had punished him And so what would their mood be towards Lorenzo or towards Cesare?
He saved us.
Yeah, thankful, right. He saved us. He's come into the rescue. I mean, he obviously didn't know what was happening. All right? So he gets the best of both worlds. He gets their fear, which they're not going to change right away. I mean, if people have been treated very harshly, they're going to have that fear. And in the back of their mind, there's going to be some wondering, okay, what could happen next? And did Cesare really know or didn't know? Okay? So they're going to have that in mind. But at the same time, they're going to be so happy and grateful, and they're going to respect him. And what Machiavelli knows is that in order to lead well in the long run, you have to get people's respect. Okay? You have to get their basic acceptance, or it's very, very difficult. So this is the way that Borgia did it. Okay? Now, yes, it was wrong to order Yorko to be so cruel and to kill people without any sort of justice. And it was wrong to stab Yorko in the back and kill him, even though he was just doing what you told him to do, too. Okay? But it worked. And so Machiavelli doesn't dwell on whether it was right or wrong. He knows that from the moral perspective it's wrong to do these things. But on the other hand, look what he obtained. Peace, tranquility, a new territory that he might be able to turn into something productive. People might actually be able to start making some money. You know, their families might be better off as a result of those actions. And Machiavelli looks at that. Okay? He looks at the outcome. And the outcome is better. Okay? Before, they were terrorized by bandits. They could never, save up anything. They could never make any money. There was a great deal of poverty. Now, with the order established, even though it was established at a price, a fairly high price, now they have a chance to build and be productive. Okay? And they're going to forget what happened in the past. And this is interesting. Machiavelli really thinks that people look forward. They look at what's happening right now. They don't think about the past, okay? Or they don't dwell on it. If good things are happening now. Now, Machiavelli says Cesare was such a genius that he had even thought further ahead and anticipated that his father was getting old and would die, and that he would need to find a new pope in order to continue this relationship, okay? So that, the two could work together. And so Borgia had actually started the process of corrupting the cardinals who would be in charge of making that decision. And he was trying to influence them through money, I'm sure, through promises and so forth. Okay? It's a terrible picture. But Machiavelli admired that. He admired that Borgia had thought that far ahead. A Machiavellian leader thinks multiple steps ahead at what needs to be done, not just at the moment. He doesn't just think about the moment. So Cesare had started that, but ultimately he didn't succeed, and that's because he himself got sick, okay? Which isn't exactly a fault. It's just there are some things that life throws you that you can't fight back from, okay? Namely, illness and death. Machiavelli didn't think there was any way that one could get around that. Okay? So, Alexander died, but Borgia was already sick himself. And then he says Borgia also died before he could complete his vision. But he said he did as well, given his circumstances, as any leader possibly could. And so he should be a model. This is what he says on page 26. It seems to me he ought to be set up as I have done, to be imitated by all those who by fortune and with others' arms have ascended to imperium. Okay? So he does note that he had fortune. Fortune was his relationship with his father, which he made into good fortune. Could have been bad. Okay? He could have been a total failure because of that relationship, but he turned it into something positive. And also, he used others' arms, the French auxiliaries. He didn't use his own. So those are two qualifications. It would be better to not use others' arms in particular. I mean, you have to use what fortune gives you. But Machiavelli tells us time and again it's better to use your own arms. And in fact, in another part of this book, he does show how before he died, Borgia had gone from the auxiliary troops to mercenaries and then to his own fighting force. And that was the best. Okay, so Borgia did understand that using other people's arms is not the best. And he had done something to change it. It's better not to have such fortune, okay, you might say, or not to rely as much on your father as he did. But if that's what you've got, and Machiavelli always goes on what you actually have, not on what you would like to have or what would be ideal, then he did the very best that he could with what he had. Okay? But it is kind of ironic that in the end, what caught up to him was something no one can avoid, and that is disease. All right. Well, you don't need to start copying this down because I'm going to put this back up on the screen next time. But what we're going to do is we're going to compare Borgia to this other character, Agathocles. So pay special attention to that as you're reading in chapter 8. We'll see you next time.